Hey there, have you ever felt like creating user interfaces for your Android app was a bit of a puzzle? Well, say hello to Jetpack Compose, a superhero-like toolkit that swoops in to save the day. Imagine you're an artist with a blank canvas, ready to paint your UI masterpiece. But wait, there is a catch. The traditional way of designing Android interfaces involve a lot of complex code, like mixing colors without a proper palette. It's like trying to build a sandcastle with the square bricks. Not very intuitive, right? Here's where Jetpack Compose comes to the rescue. It's like a magic wand that transforms your UI creation process into a delightful and smooth experience. It's all about making things easier and more fun. Instead of wrestling with the clunky XML layouts and wrestling with numerous view hierarchies, Jetpack Compose lets you build interfaces using a declarative and straightforward approach. You describe how your UI should look like and behave, and voila, Jetpack Compose takes care of the intricate coding behind the scenes. So if you're ready to level up your app design and development game, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, and let's dive into the exciting world of Jetpack Compose together. So what is Jetpack Compose? So Jetpack Compose is an Android modern toolkit for building native UI. It simplifies and accelerates UI development on Android. So this is just a modern toolkit which is designed lately. So let's look, why do we need Jetpack Compose and why should we bother and create a new toolkit while we have an existing toolkit? So let's look here first. The existing toolkit has been around for a decade, and since then devices have changed as well as users' expectation, which existing toolkit was designed for. So hence a modern toolkit is required to accelerate and make building UI more easily and efficient. So as you can see here, we have two different images. So this is around 2009, 2010, and this is around 2022. So as you can see here, you notice the difference in design and also how things are going to be built. And this is just showing us that user expectations and also the demand is changing. So for this case, we have to use a new modern toolkit that is going to help us to design this easily. So don't get me wrong, you can easily create these UIs by using the existing toolkit, but this will be a little bit difficult. So getting a UI that is easily integrated with these things, so for example, complex animations and other things, might be easier when we use a modern toolkit. And this is what is all about Android Jetpack Compose. Now let's look at the declarative UI versus imperative UI. So we have two ways of creating a UI in Android, and the first one is just the declarative and also the imperative. So let's look at first the traditional way of creating the UIs. So as you can see here, we have to define an XML layout, and for this case we can easily define different views. So for example, here we have a button view and also a text view. And for that case, in order to interact with this layout, we have to also define an activity or fragment that is going to get access of these views and also interact with them. So we have functions like, for example, find view by ID, which is going to give us the reference to this layout here. And for that case, all of these activities and the XML layout have the state. So we have to observe the state and also react to states when this changes. So for example, if a user clicks this button, so we have to first find the ID, then we have to access this method here, the onClick method, and then fire up what we want to do. And for this case, we have to update the state. So this is going to bring us one problem, which is just the synchronization problem. So we have to synchronize everything by ourselves. And this can be a little difficult and a daunting task when we have a deep nested layout or a complex layout. So for this case, this is just really difficult. Okay, now let's look at the declarative way by using Jetpack Compose. So as you can see here, we have two places. So we have a state and also we have a UI. So a state is completely decoupled from the UI. So the UI is actually immutable, meaning that we cannot change the UI when it is already rendered. So for this case, we have to react to state changes in order to change the UI. So how are we going to change the UI if the UI is immutable? So for this case, we have to redraw the entire UI when a state changes. So this seems like inefficient because we have to re-render the entire UI if, for example, only a text field changes. So this is not the case with Jetpack Compose. So it only updates change the UI component. So for example, if we have that text field and the text field has changed, then we are going to re-render only the text field, and we are going to see how this works in a background when we write the actual code. Okay, now let's look at a sample code. So we have here a Jetpack Compose code that is written in Kotlin. So when you look this, you can see it's just like a normal Kotlin code, which is actually the same but different. So we have here a function that is just called a Jetpack Compose, and how to differentiate between a composable and a normal function is just by using this annotation here. So when you annotate a function with @composable, then we know this is going to be a composable function. Now, when you look here at the right hand side, we have here an image that is rendered from this piece of code here. And basically here we have the background, which is just going to be the system background. And also here we have, for example, a card, and also we have an image and a Jetpack Compose text. And these are basically arranged in a vertically sequenced format. So when we arrange things in Android, we use layouts. So for example, this arrangement here is just vertically sequenced, and this is just used by a column. And as you can see here, we have written a column, and this column actually contains two child, and the first child is just an image, which is just a Jetpack Compose logo, and this is just inserted here by passing this image composable function. And after that, we have a text, and this text here actually is what is going to be rendered here. And also we have the animated visibility. So for example, here we have two states. So the first state is collapsed and expanded. So as you can see here, we have defined this state, expanded, and this is wrapped inside a state of a mutable state of, and by default is just false. So by default, this text here is not going to be viewable unless a user performs an action. So for example, when we click this here and change, as you can see, we have a clickable modifier that is going to tell, hey column, be expanded. And for this case, our state is going to change from expanded to for example, to a collapsed state to an expanded state. And this is what animated visibility is going to perform animations in order to reveal that text. With just a simple line of code, we have achieved a powerful UI by just writing, for example, 3 or 5 lines of code. So this is just all about Jetpack Compose, and we are going to see it in more detail. If you are still confused, don't worry, just enjoy this piece of code for the first time. Then we are going to write this from basic up to profession. Okay, so now we want to see how we can easily create a new project. So for example, if you have an existing project opened and you want to easily open a new project, you can easily navigate here to files, and then you can come here to new and call this new project here. So we can easily create here a new project. And for that case here, we have this pop-up window where we can easily configure our application. So as first, we select here an empty compose activity, and then we can just define this application here. So for example, this, we are just going to call it a state. Okay, now let's create a simple ordering application. So this application is going to be basic and ugly looking. And the purpose of this video is to teach you some basics of Jetpack Compose and how things actually work. So right now, let's delete everything which we have here, because we're going to write everything from scratch for ourselves. Okay, now let's delete this and remove everything else. Okay, so the first thing here which we want to do is to deal with. So let's create a new composable function. So we can just write comp here in order to generate a composable function. And here we're just going to call this order. So inside this composable function here, we want to create a row. So a row is just something that is going to align items in a horizontal sequenced format. So when we want to align 2 items horizontally, then we can use a row. So for example, here, let's write a row. And basically here we can pass in different types of things. So the first thing here is just the modifier. So a modifier is just something that is going to modify the behavior of our application or of a specific function. So for example, here we can just pass in a modifier. So we want this modifier to occupy the whole width. So for this case, we can just tell this modifier, hey, we want to hold the whole width of our application. So for this case here, we can just call fill max width. Also, we can just put this in a next line here. So there are other things which we can easily insert here, and we are going to see them. Okay, so right now inside this, we have a row scope. So a row scope here is a place where we can just put our composables, which are going to be arranged in a horizontal format. So the first thing here which we want to do is to create a text. And this text here is going to tell us the orders which we have. So for example, let's create here a simple text. Okay, so the first text, this is just going to be shown there. And we want to show the amount of avocados which we are going to have. So we are going to see here how many avocados which we are going to be ordering. So we are going to add this in a moment. So right now here we want also to have a button. So whenever we click that button, we want to increment the number of avocados which we want to order. So for here we want first to add a space between these two items. So first here we can just create a simple preview function that is going to help us to preview what we are writing here. So we can just use a shortcut of prev, and basically here this is going to create a preview function, and we want to call this, for example, prev or order item. And we want to show the system UI, so we can just call here show system UI and make it to be true. Okay, now let's come here inside the split screen and view. Okay, so this is just the view of what we have written. As you can see here, we have the avocados by inserting a text here. So what we want to also insert here is just a space. So we want to insert here a space horizontally, and then we have to put, for example, an icon. So basically here we can just create a spacer composable function, which is just a composable function that renders a space, which is just a transparent view. So let's create here a modifier. And basically we want to provide a size. So we want to say, for example, we want this size to occupy a certain width and height. So for our case here, we're going to make a size, for example, of 16 dp. So this is just going to be a white space that is going to differentiate between these two composables. Okay, so another thing here which we want to add is an icon. So this icon, we are going to use it to react when we are going to make changes. So let's create here an icon, and we can just add this icon with image vector here. So basically here we want to pass in the image vector, which is just going to be a representation of that particular icon. So for example, here we can use icons, and we want to use defaults. And here basically we have to use this add, and these are just the icons which are bundled inside Jetpack Compose, so we can easily use them. Okay, also here we have the content description. So here we can just pass null because we are not just going to use this content description. Now let's keep this in a separate line. Okay, now let's try to rebuild here and see the output. Okay, so as you can see here, we have rendered an icon and also the text and arranged them in a horizontal format. So right now here, there is nothing which is going to change because we do not have any type of a state. So we have a UI, and as you can see here, UI in Jetpack Compose are immutable by default. So we have to create a state, and a state is going to help us to mutate this UI and change it to a certain type. So let's speak about a state first and understand what is a state. First, understand what is a state. So a state is any value that can change over time. So this actually includes data from a database or a variable in a class. So for example, a most recent message is going to be a state. So state determines what is shown in the UI at any particular time. So for example, if we have a collapsed state, then we are going to display a collapsed UI. So if we have an expanded state, then we have to display the expanded UI. So actually a state is going to determine what is shown in the UI at that particular time. So before we just write the code of a state, we have to understand first events. So we said a state is any value that changes over time. But what changes that state? So we have to understand this. And basically events are input generated from inside or outside of an application. So this can be, for example, a user interaction, i.e. typing in a text field. So when we type in a text field, actually we are going to change the state, and actually this is just an event, and basically we have to change the UI. Or we can have a network call, and that network call is going to return us a result, and actually we are going to change a state from initial state to a new state, and thus we have to change the UI. So while the state of the app offers a description of what to display in the UI, so events are just the mechanism through which the state changes, so resulting in changes of UI. So when we have the state, again, the state determines the UI, and events are going to be the mechanism in which a UI changes. So these are going to be crucial when we are writing our code. So we have to understand the difference between events and also state. So a state is going to determine the UI, and the events are going to trigger changes in this state. Okay, so according to the definition is that a state is anything that changes over time. So for that case here, we can easily create a state. So right now, let's create here a variable. So this variable, we are going to call it, for example, quantity. So we want to understand the quantity of the avocados. So for example, here we are initializing this to an initial state, and this is just going to be 0. Show or display this quantity when the user is going to be ordering, and we want to increment this value when a user is going to be adding more values. So for this case here, we can just use a string template and access our quantity variable, and for that case here, we are going to display it in the UI. Okay, so how can we change this state? So particularly, we said that we are going to have events. So these events are going to be called in order to change this. So one thing is just clicking a button. And here inside our UI, we have designed a plus button, which is going to be incrementing these values. So for this case, we can just capture that interaction and then change the state. So for this case, we have to modify here our icon in order to allow incrementing or clickability of this variable in order to change the state. So we can just pass in here a modifier and create a modifier that is clickable. So we can just call this modifier.clickable. So this is going to modify the behavior of this icon and making it clickable. So for this case, inside here now we have the clickable, and we can just change this icon. So whenever we click this, we want to increment our state by 1. So for this case here, we can just call our quantity, and then we reinitialize this to 1. So we are going to be incrementing this value, which is going to be stored here by 1. So for that case, we have our values which are going to be incremented. Okay, so right now we can just navigate inside here our main activity. So we want to pass in the order, which is just the function which we have created. And basically here we can just easily run this. So I'm going to run this inside our application so that we can interact with it. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the numbers of our avocados, and here we have another button which we can easily click in order to modify it. Now let's try to click here, and as you can see, nothing changes here. So I'm going to explain why nothing is happening here. Okay, so we have displayed here the order and also the quantity, but when we click the button, nothing changes here. So this is happening because of one thing. So a composable is going to change when the state is being observed. So here, this state here is not observable because the composable does not know if this is a state. And actually here we have to observe it in order to actually increment this value. So how can we do this? So we can use, for example, the live data, or we can use another observable mechanism which is easily observed by composable, and this is just called the mutable state of. So for example, if we change here and add here, for example, a mutable state of, so we can just call here the mutable state. So we have this type here, and we want to specify the type to be an int. And basically we have to change this here. So here we have to specify a mutable state of, and basically here we can easily not pass. For example, you can pass in here 0, and basically this is just going to be a mutable state of. So we are getting here an error, and we are going to fix this in a moment. So this is just how the state actually works. And this error here is just creating a state object during composition without using remember. So I'm going to speak about remember here in order to give you a context why. So as you can see here, if you run your application, you are going to see that whenever we change the state, this state is not changing because this mutable state of is just an observer and is observing this. But whenever we change the state, this state is going to be initialized back to 0 or to a default state because there is no mechanism that is going to tell, hey, you have to remember this value. So we have to use a remember function in order to store this value during composition, because when this changes or when this value increments, the composable compiler is going to call up this code here again and again, because this we have not kept in a remember function, then this function is going to be initialized back to 0, and that's why we are not going to get an increment of a variable. So how can we fix this? So basically here we can just press Ctrl X, and we want to insert here a remember, so we can just call and actually use this remember with a calculation inside here. And basically we are going to open up a lambda function, and here we can easily pass in a mutable state. So right now here we are getting an error because we cannot reinitialize this. So in order to reinitialize this quantity, we have to get that value. So when you call .value here, we're going to get actually that integer, because we want to mutate a mutable state, and mutable state does not know how to be mutated. So for this case, we can just call quantity.value. And here basically we can change back to val, because we are not going to be changing or reinitializing this to a new mutable state. Otherwise, we are just changing this value, which is wrapped inside a mutable state. And that's why here we are using a quantity.value and then reinitializing this to 1. So right now, let's try to run our application and see the changes we have made. Okay, so as you can see here, we're just getting a weird output. So because here we have used this quantity directly here, and basically here we want to use the quantity.value. So for this case, let's call here .value in order to access that value, which is just going to be an integer. So now let's rerun again. Okay, so here is just our output. As you can see, we have those avocados, and right now the increment is just in 0. So when we place this button here, as you can see, now we can just increment this because we are just changing the state. Again, this is just an event which we are going to increment this value by changing the state. And when we change the state, that state is going to change the UI, and that's why we are rendering here 1. And whenever we click this, is going to add this until to a point where we are not going to be clicking. So this is how state and events actually works in Jetpack Compose. So Compose is just a declarative UI framework, so this is not a surprise as you understand right now. So instead of removing UI components or changing their visibility when state changes, we describe how the UI is under specific conditions of that state. So for example, if that state, for example, is just in a collapsed state, then there are certain types of view which are not going to be a part of composable. And we're going to see this when we write more code inside our applications. So first we enter the composition. Again, here we recompose 0 or more times if there are changes made. And whenever we quit this composable, for example, navigating to another screen, then we are going to leave the composition. In this case, we have an efficient way of just re-executing and changing the state. So this actually helps us in several things. The first one is just avoid manual state update, and also it is less error prone because it's just a manual state update. It's not a manual state update. The key idea here is if the UI is what the user sees, then the UI state is what the app says they should see. The state is going to determine what is shown in the UI. So I'm stressing this in order you have to understand the state, because Jetpack Compose, everything is actually a state. Okay, so now we want to create another composable. So this composable is going to get the username, and again, we can easily submit and show the order to the user. So let's create here another. So here we want to display items in a column format for the first time. So in order to display that, we can use a column. So this is just a layout that is going to stack elements in a vertically sequenced format. So now let's create here a column. This is just a column composable here. Okay, so inside here we want to create a text, and right now it's not just a normal text, but we want to create a text field because we want to get the user input. So we can just call this text field, and this is going to give us two values, the values and their own value changes. So basically right now here we have to pass in a state, because whenever we pass nothing here, we are not going to actually change the state. So in order to change this, we have to create here a state. So for example, here we can create a variable, and we want to call this name. And we can easily initialize this by using a remember. So you know that this remember is going to help us to store the value in a composition. And after we create here, we have to pass in a mutable state of in order to tell, hey, you have to observe this value here. And basically, we are going to pass in an empty string. So that is going to be an initial state for the first time. So we don't want to display anything here. So basically here in a place of a value, we have to pass in a name. And here we have another lambda function here. This is just the onValue change. So when you press Ctrl Q, and right now, because we're having an error, we cannot see the documentation. So first we can add here to curly braces, and these are just a lambda function. So when you press, also here we have to change this. And here we are getting another error because we have used directly this name here. And we can use name.value in order to get actually that value, which is going to be of type string, which is evident when you look here. And this is just the name.value. And here we have the onValue change. And when you press Ctrl Q, you can see that this value parameter here is actually a string that returns a unit. So this is just a lambda function here, which we can deal with it. So how can we change this state here? So let's put first this in a separate line. And right now here we have a lambda function. And when you open up it, you can see we have a reference, which is just it. And that is going to be a string. So whenever a user is going to be typing here, we're going to get that data. So when you press here Ctrl Q, you can see the callback that is triggered when the input service updates the text. So this is going to be triggered when the user is typing inside the keyboard. So for this case, we have that text, and we can just call here the name.value, and then we can easily change it to another thing, which we can pass in here to be it. And that is how you can easily modify a state inside a text field. Now let's try to re-execute here our file. So we cannot see these changes. So let's create here another preview composable. And basically call here our user data. And here we have to add the @preview annotation. So let's create here preview. And basically here we want to show system UI, and you can make this to be true. Again, now we can just come here inside a split view, and we can easily see the changes which we have made. And you can click here build and refresh in order to refresh this. Finish to create here our preview. So let's just preview here. We have another preview. So we have the order, and here we have that preview function, which is just going to be previewing the user data. So basically now let's just navigate here, and we can easily zoom. Okay, so as you can see, this text field here is just empty, and we have to tell the user what this is going to be. So we want to tell them, hey, type your name here. So right now, let's just come here inside our text field, and below this onValue change here, we can pass another parameter inside this text field, which is just called label. So let's pass in here a label. And basically this label is also a lambda function. So we can just deal with this label here. Okay, so inside here, let's create a text. And now let's re-render again and see the output. Okay, so as you can see here, we have inserted a name. So whenever a user is going to click here, then they know that they have to pass in their name. Okay, so another thing which we want to add here is just a button which is going to help us to submit the order which we have taken. So for our case here, now let's navigate here inside our code. So below this text field here, we want to create another button. And this is just a button inside a composable function, and it has a click parameter which we can easily use here to click it. And again here inside this button, we have something which is called the row scope. So basically, if we want to provide the icon or the text of this button here, so for example, for our case, we want to pass in a text. So we can just call this text. And basically inside here, we want to specify what this button is going to be named. So for example, we want to call this submit. Okay, so we have here the onClick method, which is going to help us to submit. So right now, I'm not going to do anything, but later I'm going to show you how you can change this. So we want to add here a space between this text field and this button. So we can just call here our spacer. And we specify a size of 16 dp to separate between these two text field and the button. So now let's re-preview here the changes we have made. So we can just click here in order to rechange this. Okay, so as you can see here, right now we have a name, and also we have a submit button, which you can easily click in order to submit. So one thing which we want to add here is another state that is going to be able to display that name of this user. So now let's jump inside here our code. So inside here our name, we are going to create another state, and this is state here. Okay, so before we create this state, as you can see here, we have been using the name equals to this, and here we have to use the dot value in order to access that variable. So basically here we can just get easier by using the Kotlin extension function that is just called a by, and this by is going to give us access to this value directly, which is wrapped inside the mutable state of. So we have to import the get and set values. So first we can just import this get, and also we have to import the get value and the set values. And for that case, we have everything which we need. So instead of using this name.value, right now we are just getting error. So we can just remove this name.value, and also here name.value, we can just remove this. And basically we are going to get the same changes, but right now with more robust code, and easily we can just read it. So this is just a simple way. So let's create here another, and we can use here this delegate method by, and basically here we can use now a remember and pass in here a mutable state of, and right now we are going to pass in a mutable state of false in order to access this variable. So we want to create here another text that is going to be showing the name of this user here. We can write an if statement. So in order to hide the visibility, we are just going to remove this inside the composition by using a control structure. And basically we are just using here Kotlin functions or Kotlin features inside this composable function. So we can just write here an if statement, and this if statement is going to help us to remove this inside the compose tree. So basically here right now, let's write, for example, and basically now let's create here a text. So we can use this name, which is just a state here. So as you can see, we have reused that state here easily by just calling this name here and displaying this name here. And for that case, we can easily show the name. Another thing which we want here is that when a user is going to click this button here in order to show the name, so we have to first change that state into a state that, so that we can easily re-enter this inside the composition. So we can make this text field to enter composition. So how can we do this? So we have to trigger an event inside here, the onClick. So inside the onClick method, we can just call this state here show data and change it back to true. So basically here we can just create a show data and reinitialize this to true. And for this, when we click this button, then we are going to show it to true. So also let's create another button, and that button is going to help us to restore that state. So we have to create these two buttons here, and we can wrap them inside a row. So for example, let's press here Ctrl X in order to cut this button here. So we are going to refactor this code. So let's create here a row. Okay, so this row here, we can just put these two buttons, and we can paste this and change the data here. So instead of submit, we can just call this reset. And basically here, instead of show data, then we can just make this to be false. And we want to add a space between these two buttons and pass in a modifier and make it, for example, to be 16 dp. So right now, we want to call this user data inside here our main activity, so that we can just execute our file. So inside here, the main activity, we want to display these two things inside the column. So basically we want to display this order quantity or the quantity here inside the column. So we can just press Ctrl X here and basically create a column. And inside here, we can just pass in order, and we can create here a little spacer and basically provide a size, modifier.size, and pass in here a size of 16 dp, for example. And again, we have to call, right now here, we want to call our user data. Okay, so right now we have called this inside our main activity. We can easily re-execute and see the changes inside our application. So now let's run again. Easily increment this value. Also here we have this place where we can pass in the name. So basically here now we can just click this, and as you can see, we have here a place where we can just type inside here. So for example, let me write here the name Saeed, and we want to click submit here. So as you can see here, we have nothing here inside the composition, but when we click submit here, we are going to see this Saeed, and when we click this reset, this is going to disappear. And again, when we click submit, we are going to recreate this. Okay, so one thing which I want to show you here is when this is going to have nothing. So when we click here submit, we are just showing nothing, but we are making that text to intercomposition. So we don't want to allow a user when they are not typing anything, if there is nothing inside here, the name, then we have to disable these buttons here. So how can we do this? You can just control click inside this user data here. So inside this user data here, we want to disable the buttons. So we have here our first button, and basically inside here, we can just create another function here, or another parameter, which is just called the enabled. So let's pass in here enabled. And basically we want to put this in a separate line so that we can view them easily. So we want to check if the name is going to be blank. So we can just call this name, which is just particularly a string, and call it dot blank, and check if is not blank. So basically here, this if is not blank, basically it's going to return true, and we have to enable the button. And if this is going to be blank, then it's going to return false, and we can disable this button here. So we can easily highlight this and Control C, we copy this. And again here, we can easily pass this inside here. So we press Control V in this reset button here, and we want to put this in a separate line. So basically here we have also changed inside this reset button by passing this enable, and if it's not blank again, we can just perform the same logic here. Now let's try to re-execute again and see the output. Okay, so as you can see here, we have this submit and reset button. When this is just going to be empty, then they are just disabled. So as you can see, we cannot just click them, but whenever we type here, for example, let's pass in the name, and they are changing to this enabled state here. And this is just directly the internal state of this button here. And now we can just click submit. And now let's assume here we delete this. Again, they're just going to be in a disabled state. And also let's, for example, type here an empty space. And as you can see, they're just still disabled until we type inside here a certain character. Then again, we can just easily submit this, and also we can reset. And this is just how you can easily modify and create a state inside Jetpack Compose. Okay, so I have shown you different ways of writing a state here. So for example, we have this, and when you have a state that requires us, for example, here to perform this change and the on value change here, because here we have, for example, when you press Ctrl Q, you can see we have a lambda function that requires us to perform by passing here a lambda function, which we can easily change it. So there is another way which you can easily declare a state, and that is actually more readable, and we can easily see here. So for example, let's look here, we have been declaring this name, and this name is used inside here text field. So I'm going to show you another way. So instead of passing here a name, we want to pass in here the name and the on name change. So we can just add here two parentheses, and then we pass in here the name, and we can pass here on name change, for example. And here, instead of using this delegate method by, so we can just pass in here an equal sign. And basically here right now we have the value, and also we have the name. And now instead here of changing this name directly here, basically we can just remove this. And when you navigate here, you can see we have this on name change. And when you press Ctrl Q, you can see this on name change is actually a lambda function, which is just of type string that returns a unit. And this is just similar to what we want here inside our on value change, which is just a string and that returns a unit. So in this place, we can entirely pass just the on name change, and this will work as how it worked in the previous. And instead here of using val, we can just change this to val and not reassign this name here. And this is just going to make us our code more readable and also more robust. Okay, so right now here we have this simple UI. So we want, when we type in here a name and we click submit here, we're just getting a name. So we want to get that the values of these avocados here a user has ordered, then we want to display it inside this name here. So we say, for example, Saeed has ordered, for example, 4 avocados. So how can we pass this value from this another composable to this composable here. So when you look here inside our composables, we have two types of composable. So the first one is just the order composable, and also we have the user composable. So when you look at this, all of them, they contain state, and this is just an internal state. So when you look this, it contains its own state, and also here this user data contains its own state. And basically when a composable is containing state that is using this, we call it a stateful composable. And basically this is just called an internal state. So an internal state is just not really good, because these are making the composable not reusable and making them more complex to test them. So for this case here, we want to perform a thing that we can move this state to a place where we want to make this state stateless. So we are going to speak about state hosting and what it means. What is state hosting? So a composable that uses remember to store an object contains an internal state, so making the composable stateful, as we have seen inside our code. So this is useful in situation where a caller does not need to control the state. So composables with internal state tend to be less reusable and harder to test, as we have stated earlier. So state hosting in Compose is the pattern of moving state to a composable caller to make a composable stateless, and a composable that does not hold any state are called the stateless composables, and these are just good in order to make our code more reusable and readable. Okay, so when we are going to be performing state hosting, we have to consider something which is called unidirectional data flow, and this we are going to be reusing it so much inside our code, so you have to understand this. So it's just the pattern where the state goes down and the events goes up. So as you can see, that is called the state hosting, is how we implement this architecture in Compose. So when we move the state, for example, from the order, and then we pass it to the main activity, so thus we are just moving the state up, and then we have to pass in the events which are going to go down, and then we react them. So for example, here we have the state, which state is going to be to a caller composable, which is for our case is just the main activity. And then here we have the events, which are just inside the composables, which have to rise up to the caller. And for this case, we have these changes. So the state flows down and the events goes up. So this is going to be clear when we write our code. So let's see the importance of state hosting. So this is just a single source of truth. So by moving the state instead of duplicating it, we're ensuring there is only one source of truth. So this is going to help us avoid bugs. So for example, if we want to use this state again in another place, we can actually get the same value, and we should have only a single source of truth. Also, it is shareable. So hoisted state can be shared with multiple composables, as we have seen. Also, another thing is interceptable. So callers to the stateless composable can decide to ignore or modify the events before changing the state. So for this case, we can easily intercept the events, and then we can change the state, for example. Also, this means we have decoupled our state from the UI. So the state for a stateless composable function can be stored anywhere, and for this case we can store it, for example, in a ViewModel. So we are going to see this in later videos, how we can store state inside a ViewModel. Okay, so now let's start with our order composable function, and we want to hoist the state. So in order to hoist the state, we have to move this state from this composable, because now we have this composable is stateful. So when we press here Ctrl X, basically we are making this composable stateless, and we are moving this to the composable caller. So for our case, this is just our main activity. So we are going to put it here inside this set content. We have the state, and we want this state to flow down to the order. So how can we do this? Basically here we have to pass in the order. So inside here we can just call the quantity. Okay, so right now instead of passing here quantity.value, we can easily just remove this .value, and here we can remove this .value. Okay, so we are getting here error. We cannot change this quantity here because this is just immutable by default. So how can we do this? Then now we have to pass in the event. So the event now have to arise from this order function, just going up to this caller composable, which is just the set content here. So we are going to call this inside our set content composable function. So how can we do this? Then we have to create a callback by creating here a lambda function. So let's create here a lambda function, and we can just call this onQuantityChange. And basically here now we can just pass in here what we want to pass. So for example, this is going to have a parameter which is just going to be of type int, and this is just going to return a unit. Instead of changing this state inside here, we're just going to invoke this lambda function inside this clickable here. So we can just delete this and call here the onQuantityChange. And basically we want to invoke it. And if you don't want to invoke here, you can just pass in these two parentheses, and this is just going to be similarly to just calling .invoke. And basically here right now here we can just pass in an integer which we want to increment. So instead of passing here an integer, we can just remove this because we are going to be incrementing this to the composable there, and we don't have anything here. So we can just remove this int here and make it nothing here. So right now we are just executing this composable. So we have no parameter and also return no parameter, but we want to execute this inside here because we have this clickable modifier inside our icon. So right now here we are going to get some errors when we go to our order. So as you can see, we have to pass in the quantity. So the first thing, we can just pass in here our quantity. And the quantity here, which is just defined inside our state. Okay, so instead of using .value, we can just pass in here by. And we can modify this to actually receive just an integer. So right now we have passed in here our quantity. Okay. And because here this lambda function is just the only parameter at the last, so we can just use the trailing lambda syntax here by opening two curly braces instead of just passing here another parameter. So for this case here, we are going to now have a scope that is going to be executed whenever we click here. So this is just a clickable callback. And basically inside here, we want to modify the state. So we can just call here our quantity. And we want to reinitialize this by 1, so we can just return from where we did the first time. And instead of passing here val, we can just pass in var inside our quantity state variable. So this is just how you can state hoist for the first time. You can just remove these two curly braces here and remain with this same thing. Okay, so we are just getting here another error. So inside our preview order, we have to also change this, because inside here we have to pass in the quantity. So for example, for our case, we can just pass in here 0 for quantity and pass in this empty lambda function. Okay, also we want to modify this user data. We want to hoist the state to the composables. So we can do the same. So what we want to do here, we can just easily use this and press Ctrl X in order to, and basically we can just rename also this. So we can just press Ctrl X. So we are going to do this a lot inside your programming life. So I think it's just a good skill to understand. So right now, as you can see, we have the show data and the onShow data, which is just going to be the onShow data change. So we have to add here onShow data change. And now let's refactor here our function, because we have to pass in here the name. So for example, here we can just pass in here the name. Okay, now let's put this first in a separate parameter. Also, we want to get that show data. And basically here we have the name and the onName change, which is just used inside our text field. Also, we want to change here the button. So inside here, the button, we want to use this show data and change the composable. So we can just call here the onShow data, onShow data change, and actually invoke this and pass in here the composable changes. So we can just call this to be false. So for example, we are going to submit here. So we have to pass in here true. And also inside here, this button here, the show data. And actually we can easily invoke by just creating these two parentheses. And here we can just pass in false. Okay, so here we are just getting an error. So we have to pass in those parameters. basically here we can just pass in an empty lambda function. Okay, so when we finish here, we can just navigate. We are just getting another error, which is just going to be here where we have called the user data inside our main activity. So now we have to pass in here the state actually. So basically we have to pass in here the name. And as you can see here, we can easily pass in this all of these variables here. Now let's put this in a separate line. And also when you put your cursor here at the top and you press Alt Enter, basically you can just easily add, for example, add names to call arguments. So for this case, we just add these call arguments inside here, and this is going to help us to read our code easily. So this is how actually state hosting actually works. So we have our state, which are just here up, and basically this state now are going to be passed down to these composables. So for example, here this composable actually is going to get the state here. And then we have the event. So the event here is just what we are going to execute. So this icon here, for example, is going to be clicked. And when this clickable modifier is going to be clicked, we want to execute the onQuantity change. So this is just going to be an event. So this callback here is going to be called inside our, for example, order here, where we have this onQuantity change, and basically we have rechanged this value by using this event. So when this event is going to occur, and this event is actually when a user is going to click a button, then we want to modify the state, and for this case we have changed the quantity and incremented it by 1. So this is particularly what is called unidirectional data flow and state hosting in Jetpack Compose. And this is really powerful because we're going to see how we can create complex animation and also reuse the data. So right now, as you can see, let's look here at the user data. So we want to be able to display here the name and also display the order message. So basically here now we can just add another parameter here. So let's come here in the top and add here a comma. And we want to get, for example, quantity. And this is just going to be of type int. And right now, as you can see, we are just reusing the state across different composables. So instead of just passing name here inside this text field, so we can just press Ctrl X for the first time and then open up here these two quotation marks. And we can say here you have ordered. And basically we can just access the quantity. So basically the user have ordered this quantity of avocados. And right now we can just change this user data here. And when you press Ctrl click, this is going to be taking you to where it is being called. So the first time we are just going here inside our main activity. And as you can see, we are just getting here an error. And when we pass in the named argument, we can easily displace the calling of these parameters here. So instead of Java, because as you can see inside here, we have displayed this in the first parameter. So actually here, when we pass it to the last by passing in here the named argument. So for example, here we can pass in quantity, and then we are not going to get any error. And as you can see here, we are just reusing this state across different type of composables. And also we are just getting another error. And this is just going to be arising here. So basically here we can just add this named argument, pass in here the name, and also here we can just pass in a quantity. And then let's pass it to be 10 by default here when we preview our user data. So right now here, nothing is going to change visually, but we have already changed a lot of things and make our code more robust. Now let's try to rerun our application and see the changes. So right now our application has launched successfully. Okay, so let's type inside here, for example, let's pass in the name and we want to increment the avocado. So we can just press this button here and actually increment it to 5. And right now let's click here, submit. And as you can see here, we have that Saeed have ordered 5 avocados. And guess what? The exciting journey doesn't end here. Our comprehensive Udemy course takes you on a deep dive into Jetpack Compose, spanning over 20 hours of hands-on content. Imagine mastering every aspect of Jetpack Compose from the basics to the advanced techniques, all while enjoying the convenience of online learning. Ready to become a Jetpack Compose Pro? Enroll today to gain the lifetime access to our in-depth course. Click the link below to subscribe and embark on this transformative journey. Let's empower your Android UI skills together.